This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Today's show starts with David Schemm, State Executive Director of the Kansas Farm Service Agency, as he highlights a few current farm programs, including acreage reporting, Livestock Forage Program, and base acres. Sarah Ganske, K-State Weed Specialist, keeps the show rolling, discussing what herbicide questions she has been getting related to corn, grain sorghum, and cotton. Part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with Brad White, Bob Larson, and Phillip Lancaster concludes the show explaining how value can be added to open cattle. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show with State Executive Director of the Kansas Farm Service Agency, David Schemm. David, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely, Shelby. I think it's safe to say that summer has arrived and the heat has shown up across the state. So hopefully producers and livestock are trying to stay somewhat cool out there.
I absolutely agree. And mentioning things that are arriving, an upcoming deadline that is just about here.
Oh, absolutely. And I know I've mentioned it before, Shelby, but acreage reporting, spring planted acreage reporting, July 15th. Here it is a deadline there. Strongly encourage our producers there to get a hold of their local office, schedule. If they have not heard from them already, schedule up an appointment to be able to get your maps filled out, report that acreage planning, acreage report to our local county offices. It gets a busy time of the year for them and for producers out there. I know, I'm still seeing, a wheat harvest, how would I say, has started early this year. And it seems like with rains, it's now turned into a much longer wheat harvest. So I know both harvest and even planting has been delayed for a lot of producers out there, and they're incredibly busy too. But July 15th is the deadline, so please get a hold of your local county office and get that scheduled for reporting your acreage.
And thinking about the weather and programs of the Farm Service Agency, Livestock Forage Program, and are we seeing that triggered for some counties in Kansas?
Yes, we are. And unfortunately here, Shelby, in my conversations I've had with producers across the state right now, it just seems like we have, how would I say, the haves and have-nots, maybe have too much and have too little when we talk about rain. I know some of the areas have had very bad flooding, but with that also being said, I know there have been areas that have missed out on those rains as well on that there. But Livestock Forage Program is a program that's triggered by drought monitor map for producers, for counties that have entered a D3 designation on the drought monitor map, or if they've been in a D2 for at least 4 weeks there. The county then becomes a qualifying county for assistance to those livestock producers out there. Again, kind of the key things is go into the county office. If you think you possibly triggered, get into that local county office and talk to them. They're going to be able to help walk you through that program there. You're going to need inventory counts, various things like that to be able to help them there. But Shelby, the sad part is that number has continued to increase. I know just a couple of weeks ago we were at 21 counties. Now we've jumped clear up to 39 counties across the state. And I got to say, as I see the list here, it seems like the whole south part of the state from a few counties over in the southeast, over to the southwest have definitely been triggered, including a few counties in northwest Kansas have been triggered as well for LFP. Northeast and north central Kansas haven't been triggered yet for LFP, but I think that tells us where those rains have been going.
If or once LFP becomes available to producers, is there a timeline in which they need to go ahead and get into the office to sign up for it?
They do definitely have some time. I strongly encourage producers to get into that office there. The key thing is that when that inventory count, when you know how many cows or livestock that you have out there in that pasture, that's going to be a little bit more fresh in your mind the sooner you do it to when it does trigger. So you can report to the county office to do that. They do have up to almost a year, clear into March of next year, to report that. I kind of do caution against that just because, sometimes a lot of events can occur between now and then, and being able to dig up those notes, whether it was a preg check or vaccination or whatever, remember exactly what number of cows you sent to the pastures there and have that proof. It's just a lot easier the sooner you can do it. So have some time frame to do it as quick as they can, and that make sure they have the right documentation.
What does LFP then give back to the producers?
So the Livestock Forage Program then basically computes the number of days that the county has been triggered into that qualifying drought. Again, the 4 weeks for D2 or D3 there. And then based upon the number of livestock they have, and then that computes it into our program to basically establish what the loss of forage that producer would have experienced as a result of drought for those livestock there. So again, that's the key factors from a producer's standpoint there. Inventory count for cow herd, because that allows us to put that into that formula and kick it out for those producers there. Again, based upon the number of livestock they had, grazing rates, various things like that are established for us.
And something else producers could be reporting into the FSA offices, base acre update, and how is that going?
Oh, that's going good. It was a lot of work that our county offices did in pulling up that history dig, as we called, basically looking back at the years 2019 through 2023, and over that 5-year time frame there, looking at what acres, what crops were planted on what acres. We've gotten all that work done. Producers, or landowners, I should say, have been sent out a notice via email. If we did not have an email on file for them, we've sent out a physical postcard there. But definitely for those landowners there, if they decide to opt out, they will need to respond to us by September 4th. Again, they have that 90 days. And for a few of those producers there, we might have to have some clarification on subsequent crops or which base acres they want to be able to utilize for what crop, especially when it gets into the situation of double crop and or subsequent crops there. So again, look for that email there. As always, they can utilize login.gov, go to Farmers.gov and gain that information there. It will be able to break it out. Tell them what the number of acres are for an update on per field there, and I'll be able to do that. Again, as always, Shelby, they can go into their county office there and definitely ask them. But definitely put a plug in here for producers gaining that login.gov access and being able to look at it for themselves.
How does this all tie in then for ARC and PLC?
Key component. So to let everybody know, if you're not already well aware of, ARC and PLC, those programs, whether it's the ag revenue coverage or the price loss coverage there, are based upon those base acres there for the fields there. So because of all the work that we had to do for OBA or the Working Families Tax Cut Act there, what occurred there is that we knew we weren't going to get everything done. Congress knew because of the late date they passed everything, we wouldn't get everything done. So that producers automatically for 2025 will get paid the higher of whether it's ARC or PLC for producers there based upon their base acres there that they did have there. But the update on the base acres, those will go in effect again for next year, 2026. Those new base acres for those producers there, and they will need to sign up for that. Again, we are still working on updating those base acres because there was 30 million base acres that were approved by Congress there. So based upon the number of landowners that opt in and decide to update acres and the available acres that we have left, we'll know how many of those acres that producers have the option of that they actually will be able to update, Shelby. So long story short, essentially on the situation, producers, they did not have to worry about signing up for ARC PLC in 2025, but 2026, we will sign up, and we'll be signing up, kind of anticipating a late summer, early fall sign up for producers on whether or not they elect for ARC or PLC. And then when they elect for those, again, that will reflect the updated base acres there. And Shelby, just again for reference for everybody out there, these payments get issued in October there. But again, remember when they get issued based upon the previous year. For the payments that ARC PLC payments that producers are receiving this year, they're actually for the 2025 year. And then again, next year in October in 2027, they will be reflecting the payments based upon this 2026. Again, just for everybody knows, why do we do that way? Well, simply by Congress, by law, we have to wait for the marketing year for the crops to close out, and those do not close out until the end of September for our corn, soybeans, a lot of that stuff to be able to establish those prices there.
So as you're looking at farm programs for Kansas Farm Service Agency, what work or how much work have you seen be happening with operations and producers?
Oh, absolutely. There's been a lot of work going on as we look out there and what FSA have been making sure that we're delivering out there to assistance there for our producers across the state there. Shelby, just in our farm program division here for this fiscal year, we've issued $1.74 billion across the state to Kansas producers. Again, I'm going to say that's within this fiscal year. And so our fiscal year starts October 1 up here now till July. So, we're done with 3/4 of the fiscal year as it will close out in September here. So definitely we've been working hard. County offices, I think many of our producers have been working hard to deliver those programs there, and we're always more than willing to help those producers at any time and get the information they need to. Again, that's why I always like to reference when we look at new technology and new tools, being able to utilize some of this new technology and new tools can help us help the producers.
David, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was State Executive Director of the Kansas Farm Service Agency, David Schemm. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing herbicides and different crops in Kansas with K-State weed specialist Sarah Ganske. Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on the show, Shelby.
Sarah, as we're thinking about herbicides right now, what are we taking into consideration when we're thinking about corn?
Yeah, so one of the things that we usually get questions about this time of year, and I think it has the potential to be particularly troublesome this year with all the rain that some parts of the state have had, is about what to do with late flushes of weeds in corn. So we have a lot of options in corn up to the time of about 12-inch corn. 12 inches is the cutoff for atrazine. So any of our, cocktails or premixes that include atrazine would be no longer options, by the time we get later into the season. So as we think about some of this larger corn, we do have still a few options for post-emergence weed control. One that has the biggest window would be Diflex. So that particular formulation of dicamba has a cutoff of V10. And then the next longest cutoff would be Lotus at V9. And then there's a handful of products that have a V8 or 30-inch cutoff. Those include Impact, Callisto, Glyphosate, and Status, and Enlist One. So quite a few options have that V8 cutoff. Most of our crops are going to be past that, I think, at this point, based on what I'm driving. So really, we're looking at applications of Diflex or Lotus probably at this point. One thing to think about, especially with the Lotus, is that we know that those HPPD inhibiting herbicides, those group 27 bleachers, which Lotus is one of them, they benefit from having a group 5 herbicide in there. Most of the time, we're going to use atrazine for that. One option as we get into bigger corn would be to use Tough, but it also has a V8 cutoff. Another thing to think about, Shelby, when we think about some of these later applications to corn is that some of these products have extended application windows. If you use drop nozzles, or maybe a better way to think about that would be to say that they have shorter application windows if you choose to go with a broadcast application without drop nozzles. I know drop nozzles can be a huge pain in the neck as we think about the time that it takes to get that sprayer set up. But I would just encourage folks to think about, the crop safety risks in some cases, and also just getting that product through the canopy where we actually need it, and making that application worthwhile instead of just sort of a revenge spray on some weeds that kind of got through our pre's.
With our recent weather conditions and just conditions happening around crops, what things are grain sorghum growers need to take into consideration when it comes to weed control?
Yeah, it seems like every summer, Shelby, I get at least one or two calls about, oh no, things went sideways in my grain sorghum field, and now I have basically no options. So those calls typically come in a couple of different forms. One of them was that residuals were sprayed early, and kind of as that spring burn down application, maybe something targeting kochia, just keeping the pigweeds out, things of that nature. But now that conditions actually are going to allow for grain sorghum planting, that pre-emergence application or that burn down application has run out. And so now we've got a mess of weeds, usually Palmer amaranth, to clean up. So that's a little bit of a tricky situation. I think probably the most effective answers to think about there would be to go out ahead of the planter with products that contain, or with an application that contains something like a Sharpen or a Reviton. The key there, a couple of keys there, would be to pay attention to the replant intervals. They're rate dependent for sorghum, and with Reviton as well. So, they can range anywhere from 0 days to 3 months. Okay. So just paying attention to those plant back intervals for the rate that folks choose. And the other thing to think about is that, just go ahead and make your at planting residual application, then. So if somebody's gone out with something like an Outlook early, go ahead and come back with some dual with this application. And I guess I said there were two things to think about, but really there's three. One of the things that our folks seem to be doing a little bit more of is I have conversations with sorghum growers, is this application of like a verdict type of application. So Outlook plus Sharpen for their early burn down. If you've done that, you've got to be cautious of, not going over maximum annual application rates for any of the products that you had in your early season burn down. So we typically have some options to get fields cleaned up. It's just going to take a little bit of thinking and a little bit of strategizing there on that part. The next most frequent question that I get, and actually this one probably comes in more often, but it's the next question that we wrote about in the e-update, is we had the best of plans. We were going to, chase the planter with the sprayer, but like always, something went sideways. And so now we've got grain sorghum up before we got our at planting herbicide application on. The short story here is that this has taken away a lot of our options for good weed control, and we don't have a lot anyway. But, thinking about, maintaining that group 15 application, right? Those can go on over the top of grain sorghum. I think that's really important. We talked about atrazine and the height restriction cutoff for atrazine in corn. It's the same for grain sorghum. It's a 12-inch application cutoff for atrazine. So you need to be mindful of that. And then, folks kind of know that the next best options for post-emergence weed control aren't awesome and often come with crop injury. But some options would be something like a kochivore type of product, a husky type of product, or a starring next type of product. If folks went with a herbicide tolerant grain sorghum, the First Act for double team and the Emiflex for eye growth, or Zest for enzyme are still on the table there as well, but they're not going to do a lot for us in terms of thinking about post-emergence Palmer amaranth control, which is usually, what these questions are driving at.
What questions have you been getting or needing to take into consideration when we look at cotton?
Yeah, so one of the things that we wrote about recently in the e-update in terms of cotton, Shelby, was just thinking about non-glyphosate tolerant cotton. So herbicide resistance, has definitely changed the way we do weed management in terms of herbicide resistant weeds. One of the things that some of our cotton companies have recognized is that there's not a lot of value for post-emergence weed control, especially when we're thinking about pigweeds, for a glyphosate resistant or glyphosate tolerant variety. And so phytogen does have some transgenic cottons that have 2,4-D and glyphosate resistance, but not glyphosate resistance. And so as we think about post-emergence weed management in those systems, we're taking away glyphosate, and really the big thing we're losing there is grass control, right? Our Enlist and our glyphosate tend to be one of our better post-emergence combinations for pigweed control in Enlist crops. So we're okay there. We need to think about grass control though. So the easy button there would be our group 1 herbicides, right? When I think of those, I think of things like clethodim, which is select, or any number of other section 3. That's another brand name for clethodim. It's going to provide good control of a lot of our grasses that we struggle with. Also thinking about Assure 2, that could be an option. Some of those quizalofop formulations, there's generics of that one as well. Liberty can bring a little bit of grass activity, but obviously not going to be what we need or what we could get potentially out of some of these other products. One other thing to think about is that sometimes glyphosate can help us with sedge control. So if folks have got yellow nut sedge, something like that in their fields, honestly, dual or some sort of S-metolachlor formulation can do a good job of suppressing yellow nut sedge. There are some ALS inhibiting herbicides, Staple and Invoke, that do have a little bit of suppression activity on nut sedges, but those two are going to come with some pretty healthy crop rotation intervals in some cases. So folks need to definitely dig into that if they're thinking about going that direction.
Do you see any glyphosate injury when we look at non-glyphosate tolerant cotton?
So I think that's a consideration that folks need to think about. We kind of lived this in the late 90s when glyphosate tolerant cotton first was coming out. Glyphosate drift is a real risk, much like folks face 2,4-D drift risks if they don't plant a 2,4-D tolerant cotton. I would say that for the most part, the glyphosate drift, just, making sure that you're being a good neighbor, right? If you have glyphosate tolerant cotton and your neighbor doesn't, obviously choose spray days when the wind is blowing away from that sensitive crop, things of that nature. But definitely something to think about in terms of a risk if folks decide to go with some of these non-glyphosate tolerant varieties.
Sarah, I appreciate you taking the time twice a day.
Thanks as always, Shelby.
That was K-State weed specialist Sarah Ganske. If you'd like to read more on these topics, I will link Agronomy E-Update articles in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we wrap up our show with part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with Brad White, Bob Larson, and Phillip Lancaster.
I've got some cows that are open, but I'd like to add some value to them before I sell them. And one of the great ways to add value is that they're no longer open. Now, we still want to sell them because they fit with my they don't fit with my herd as far as calving goes. But how do I best do that if I've got multiple pastures and the cows are in the open cows are spread out among multiple pastures? Can I take a bull? Can I rotate them around? What are the best ways to do that?
Well, and this is a good question because it comes back to some of the times we give advice, but then there are other situations. So we like to control the breeding season so that we don't have calves born over 365 days. And one way to do that is to take bulls out of the pasture. All right. So that's a general recommendation, is to don't leave bulls in the pasture all year round. But for this situation, sometimes it's like, put the bulls back in the pasture. If you've got, even just one bull per pasture type of a thing to cover those open cows. For one thing, it gives you a place to put the bulls. The housing is easier. But you do need one bull at least per pasture to cover any open cows that are there that don't fit my breeding season. But then I've got to preg check a couple of different times. I preg check the main herd and identify those open cows, maybe mark them in some way, tag or something, and then recheck those cows later. Or the other thing you can do is just take all the open cows from different pastures. So if you've got multiple pastures, as this listener does, put them all into one pasture and manage them that way. And it may be a little bit different feeding, but definitely provide them with bulls. So there are some ways to do this. They all involve having a bull in there with them.
General strategies for adding value to cull cows is pregnancy and weight, because they're going to sell by the pound. So any ideas on weight adding to them at this time of year?
So this time of year, fairly easy. I mean, let's say if you had a fall calving herd and you weaned calves off and you got some open cows, now you got lots of grass, at least in some parts of the country. And so just keep those cows out on some green grass. If they're not pregnant, they're not lactating, they're going to gain weight on green grass pretty easily. So you can put some weight on those cows, some fat on those cows, and you pretty cheaply, and then you can upgrade them when you take them to the sale barn, and they'll bring a little higher dollar or higher price because they're a little fatter and a little better condition.
Well, one of the things that makes me think of is sometimes because grass growth isn't uniform throughout the year, this time of year, if I've got grass, at least in most of the United States, I've got actually almost too much grass. So I could leave the cows on it, and then honestly, in a few weeks, as we get into midsummer, it'd be kind of nice to pull some of the grazing pressure off, and we could honestly do it that way. And
so
again, situation dependent.
It almost works a little bit like having some stocker calves as part of your operation and being able to manage your grazing pressure. So, if I got lots of grass, I keep those cows and add some more weight to them. If it's a dry year, I pull those cows off and get rid of them. I'm minimizing my grazing pressure when I don't have as much forage resource out there.
Well, just to step back a little bit, I really like this question because, the biggest part of income for a cow-calf producer is calf sale, either at weaning or after backgrounding or something like that. But cull cows are not an insignificant portion of income, and putting a little bit of thought into the timing, putting some cheap gain on them, getting them pregnant, I think that's time well spent because...
even in fall weaned calves, keeping those cows and adding a little weight onto them and selling them after the first of the year usually has a little bit higher price than if you're pulling those open cows out of the pasture and selling them there in the fall, because that's usually when most everybody else is doing it. And so that cull cow market drops off there in the fall, just like the feeder calf market does. So
if they happen to be a little bit thin, a lot of times the efficiency of gain is it's not quite as good as stocker calves, but it's pretty good.
It is pretty good, yes.
Once again, that was part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.